Thank you for taking the time to attend our presentation, How IHE is Advancing Medical Device Connectivity. Our speakers today are John Gargiulo and Zach Jones. John Gargiulo has been a computer scientist at NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, for 30 years, and co-chair of IHE's Patient Care Device Technical Committee since 2010. In 2013, HIMSS awarded John with a Certificate of Recognition for outstanding contribution to improving the interoperability of patient care devices and health IT systems. John is also the recipient of a Silver Medal Award from the United States Department of Commerce for Health Information Technology Test Infrastructure Leadership. John received his master's degree in computer science from Johns Hopkins University. Zach Jones leads the technical development of AcceleroConnect on Iatric Systems medical device integration team, and he has spent nearly a decade integrating disparate systems in the healthcare industry. Zach earned his Bachelor of Science degree from Ohio State University and came to Iatric Systems in 2013 with accent on integration. He is an IHE member and participates in IHE's annual Connectathon conference. Now I will turn it over to John to get us started.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda. I'd like to start by just saying I really appreciate this opportunity, and I am happy to discuss what I believe is a terrific effort in which all that are involved, you hear about many sides, come together to solve real-life, high-impact healthcare issues. And before we get into the agenda, I'd just like to set the stage a bit about what's going to be presented. As Amanda said, I've had the opportunity of serving the IHE PCD, which we'll hear more about. Zach will give a little more definition on that, as a technical committee co-chair for over 4+ years, a little bit over 4 years. But in the context of this, I've been involved as the test lead and as a monitor of a yearly test event since the beginning, which is almost 10 years now. And you'll, again, hear a lot more about that as we go through. So working as a federal employee for NIST, NIST is a bureau within the Department of Commerce. Our team is able to apply what we call test method and measurement science expertise. And as important, we have the benefit of being a neutral entity. We work with industry, but we're non-threatening because we're not really looking at product or operational bottom line. So I think the industry appreciates that and sort of trusts NIST as this test entity being very neutral. So some of the solutions you're going to hear about are based on, the solutions you're about to hear about are based on open standards and provide open access to all work products. So this includes free and readily available validation and verification tools, as well as specifications. And all of this information is transparent and quite rigorous. So from a hospital perspective, this is very helpful in articulating and defining procurement needs, and also increasing confidence of out-of-box product operation for key and typical to hospitals use cases and scenarios. And again, those meet rigorous testing requirements. So it's a way that you can put into your procurements particular requirements to say, I'd like to see IHE PCD products which have met testing for X, Y, or Z. And you'll see a little bit more about that as we go on. So hopefully you'll be intrigued by what you hear today, and we strongly encourage you to get involved and help to move this work forward. It's a tremendous opportunity, I think, to address real and high impact scenarios, and in particular provide your clinical and clinician perspective. A lot of medical device vendors and manufacturers and product integrators are on the team and participate within IHE, so more clinical perspective we can get, the better. What you see here is how, under what one can get involved, is Paul Sherman, who is the IHE PCD project manager, and his contact information. There's no cost to join, and there are weekly meetings. We have what are called planning and technical committee meetings, and we have more focused work around what we call integration profiles, and these address, again, some of these high impact scenarios. And there's a couple web links listed. So hopefully this will again, get you intrigued to join, and you like what you hear today, and see it's a fairly robust and cyclical type of work, and it has some very powerful tools behind it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John, for that, and good afternoon to all attendees. This is Zach Jones with Iatric Systems. Before we get started today, I wanted to note that we do have a variety of people attending the presentation. 70% of you are IT analysts or managers, 20% of which specialize in interface technology. Also, 20% of you lead your IT department as either a CIO, a CMIO, or a director. 6% of you are clinical analysts, and 4% of you are biomedical engineers. Since such a large percentage of today's attendees are technical, we're going to delve into some very technical details today. If some of that sounds like a foreign language to you, please type your questions into the questions pane of your GoToWebinar control panel, and when we break for our QA sessions throughout the presentation, we will answer those questions. We would much rather you ask questions than be lost, so please feel free to ask away. Today we will be talking about how IHE is advancing medical device connectivity. I will discuss what IHE and PCD represent and stand for, and why the IHE PCD standards matter to a healthcare organization. I will also touch on the role that those standards play in purchasing medical devices. John will cover the annual Connectathon testing event in more detail, as well as some in-depth discussion around the IHE integration testing and the corresponding tools to carry out that testing. Finally, I will discuss the IHE integration statements and how best to access and interpret those statements. So let's get started by covering the IHE PCD standards and why they matter to a healthcare organization. The Integrating the Healthcare Enterprise Patient Care Devices domain, or IHE PCD, and its corresponding standards were created in 2005 to address the integration of medical devices into the healthcare enterprise from the point of care to the electronic health record system, potentially resulting in significant improvements in patient safety and quality of care. The domain and standards are currently in the 10th yearly cycle. IHE is an open domain group for anyone who wants to participate. Participants are primarily device manufacturers, but the organization is always interested in clinicians and clinical engineers. There are always new and exciting profiles being discussed and proposed by members of the IHE organization to address and refine hospital needs. This ongoing expansion and refinement, supported by weekly calls to discuss potential additions and changes, benefits hospitals immensely throughout the procurement process. Vendor support of these standards does not absolutely guarantee interoperability, but it does give a high level of confidence that a solution will integrate successfully out of the box with very little modifications. We'll touch on a few examples illustrating the difference between integration projects with vendors who support IHE PCD standards and vendors who do not later in the presentation. The IHE PCD standards are utilized to exchange data between various medical devices, such as vital signs and physiological monitors, ventilators, infusion pumps, and anesthesia workstations, and with enterprise systems and applications such as clinical information systems and EHRs. The primary focus is from the device, which is often coupled with the device gateway, to the enterprise, which comprises the clinical information systems. The IHE PCD domain is sponsored by the American College of Clinical Engineering, or ACCE, the Health Information Management System Society, or HIMSS, and the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, or AMI. The IHE PCD standards utilize HL7 version 2.6 as a baseline, with some profile-specific drawing upon versions 2.7, 2.8, and soon version 2.8.2. The standards also comply to the ISO and IEEE 11073 specification for device communication standards. ISO and IEEE 11073 is a family of standards which is comprised of many different parts, including 11073-10101 for nomenclature and 11073-10201 for the Domain Information Model, or DIM. The IHE PCD standards also rely on the Wireless Communication Transfer Protocol version 1.3 for wireless device communications, as well as the consistent time profile in the IHE IT infrastructure domain, or the ITI domain, to ensure synchronized time across devices via the network time protocol. Before we dive into the various integration profiles that make up the IHE PCD domain, let's talk about what exactly an IHE profile is. An IHE profile provides a tested and documented solution to address a specific integration problem within a healthcare organization. Every profile is executed through a number of distinct actors. Each actor is responsible for producing, managing, and/or acting on information in the context of an IHE profile. While each profile is represented only once within a domain, an actor can be used within multiple profiles. For example, both the Device Enterprise Communication, or DEC, and the Infusion Pump Event Communication, or IPEC profiles utilize the Device Observation Reporter, or the DOR actor, which would likely represent a hospital EHR. We will cover specific actors in more depth when we drill down into each profile. Here's a brief overview of all profiles that comprise the IHE PCD domain and some example challenges that can be resolved by those profiles. First off, the Device Enterprise Communication, or DEC, and the Implantable Device Cardiac Observation, or IDCO profiles can be utilized for the collection and reporting of data from specific devices. The Alert Communication Management, or ACM profile, ensures that staff members receive necessary alerts in a timely manner on any device. Infusion order safety is covered by the Point of Care Infusion Verification, or PIV, and the Infusion Pump Event Communication, or IPEC profiles. The Waveform Content Module, or WCM, provides support for waveform data in both snapshot and continuous formats. Finally, there are two profiles surrounding medical equipment management: the Device Management Communication profile, which covers device status and potential necessary repairs, and the Location Services profile, which helps to track the physical location of both devices and persons within the hospital. So we will drill down into each profile individually to give a brief overview of each one. The Device Enterprise Communication profile first supports publication of information acquired from point-of-care medical services, or medical devices rather, to applications such as clinical information systems and electronic health record systems using a consistent messaging format and device semantic content. The clinical data stores associated with the Device Observation Consumer Actor can also be utilized for patient-specific user-initiated queries. This is performed under the retrospective data query profile. Also, the PCD01 and PCD02 labels that you see represent distinct data transaction formats. Much like actors, these transactions can be utilized by multiple different profiles to ensure that consistent message structures are used between profiles. The Alarm Communication Management profile enables the remote communication of point-of-care medical device alert conditions, ensuring the right alert is sent with the correct priority to the necessary individuals with the right content within it. The profile also supports alarm escalation and/or confirmation based on dissemination status, such as whether the intended clinician has received and/or acknowledged the alarm condition. The point-of-care infusion verification profile supports communication of a 5 rights validated medication delivery and infusion order from a barcode medication administration, or BCMA system, to an infusion pump or pump management system, thus closing the loop of the infusion order process. Optionally, the Device Enterprise Communication profile may be used to selectively monitor the status of the devices that have been programmed. The Infusion Pump Event Communication profile allows an infusion system to send detailed non-alarm information on to allow the tracking and logging of the entire history of an infusion operation. For example, messages may be sent for medication delivery and start events, as well as titration events. The medical equipment management area covers two specific profiles. The device management communication profile allows for metadata to be sent and analyzed for devices, including equipment identification, device status awareness, and battery events. The location services profile abstracts device and person location observations and events from location tracking implementation technology. The implantable device cardiac observation profile specifies the creation, transmission, and processing of discrete data elements and report attachments associated with cardiac device interrogations or observations or messages. And the waveform content module profile allows for telemetry systems to send encoded waveform snapshots and continuous waveform data, providing an important complement to accessing the current status of a patient or the status of a patient during a clinical event. The waveform data includes the type of waveform, start and event times, and clinician annotations, among other data points. So we've discussed what the IHE PCD standards are, but what role should they play in the patient care device purchasing process? At the procurement level, it is important to focus on IHE tested products. Products tested against IHE standards give you a level of confidence that, at a minimum, the products can sufficiently address the high-profile use cases that make up the profile in question. When considering a patient care device vendor, all prospective vendors should be asked if their devices have been tested at the annual IHE Connectathon testing event, and if the vendor has IHE integration statements available for viewing. We will cover both the Connectathon event and the IHE integration statements later in the presentation. Emphasis should be given to those vendors with significant testing completed with the IHE PCD standards, especially when planning complex integrations with several vendor systems and/or enterprise applications involved. The vendors of the enterprise systems being integrated with should be contacted as well to determine if there has been any previous testing completed with the device vendor. This synergy could further reduce implementation and testing time. Here's an example scenario of a project where the patient care device vendor utilizes the IHE PCD standards. First, a hospital purchases 100 bedside vital signs monitors to be integrated with their electronic health record system. The chosen vital signs monitor vendor has adopted IHE PCD standards for their device communication and has tested successfully with the hospital's EHR during the Connectathon testing event. The vital signs monitors are able to send test vitals messages to the EHR with few modifications, if any, drastically reducing implementation time. The go-live is smoother, with most, if not all, fringe cases accounted for, and there are very few post-go-live issues. And here is an example of that same scenario, only this time with a patient care device vendor who does not utilize IHE PCD standards. As in the first scenario, a hospital purchases 100 bedside vital signs monitors to be integrated with their EHR. The vital signs monitor vendor has not adopted IHE PCD standards for their device communications and has not worked directly with the EHR vendor at any point in the past. The vital signs monitor vendor and EHR vendor work closely together on the message format, with both vendors making time-consuming changes to their respective interfaces to accommodate each other's systems. Additional hospital resources are needed for testing the custom interface changes to account for use case scenarios that were not initially anticipated. The go-live may present even more unexpected interface data structure issues, requiring more time to fix before the system is ready to be used. Further upgrades of either interface may require additional changes to maintain the integration as well. As you can see, the introduction of IHE PCD standards allows for a much greater level of interface harmony out of the box, with far fewer unexpected issues at each stage of the project.
Okay, just a reminder that if you have any questions, please type them into the questions pane of your GoToWebinar control panel. We will take a short break right now for questions and answers. But don't worry, though, if there's not enough time for you to enter your question right now, we'll break for Q&A again at the end of the presentation. And remember, you can enter your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll hold all questions until the next Q&A break. And at this time, there are no questions in the queue, so let's proceed with the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, so I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I apologize, John. I was just about to introduce you. I will turn things over now to John Gargiulo to discuss the IHE Connectathon event in greater detail.
Okay, thanks again, Zach. Yeah, so we're going to switch gears a little and talk about how the testing actually happens and the events around that. And then I'll get into some of the tooling that's used to help with the event. So when the participants are actually doing these plug fests, if you will, the tooling that helps do the validation and verification. So there's in North America, first of all, there are many regional domains for IHE, and the biggest in the world is the North America Connectathon, as it's called. And it's a week-long, large-scale testing event. It's now held in Cleveland, Ohio every year at their convention center. It was previously held in the bottom of a hotel in Chicago, so both pretty chilly events, but we get a lot done because we have to stay inside. The Connectathons are designed to bring together vendors across various domains and test their systems and devices against established standards and specifications, and these are developed through IHE. IHE doesn't necessarily develop the standards, but often point to the standards. For example, as Zach had mentioned, HL7 being the primary messaging standard, and then the ISO IEEE 11073 is a standard that focuses more on the capabilities and functionality of a device and how you represent that. In a typical Connectathon event, at least for North America, there are about 150 organizations present testing all kinds of domains, and Zach and I are focusing on the patient care devices, but some other example domains are radiology, cardiology, patient care coordination, and then Zach had mentioned earlier about IT infrastructure or information technology infrastructure, and that domainal group looks at things like security and repositories and document exchange, etc. So it's a wide range of domains, a wide range of functionality being covered, and each of the domainal groups look at these very specific integration profiles as Zach has just shown us. One of the great benefits for vendors is this is just a tremendous opportunity to access many of the industry leaders in their domain and to get test oversight and in some cases clarification and grading by test monitors who've had a lot of experience in the area. This kind of testing is just invaluable because it can replace efforts that you might have to do that would normally take weeks and weeks in a matter of days because you're hitting against other products and other solutions based on whatever the prominent use cases or the scenario. So it's really project-specific testing efforts between vendors, and again, just invaluable to come together where everyone is willing to participate so you can get at interfaces and see functionalities of systems that would normally be integrated or used within the hospitals. So this is one of the great benefits of such an event is you get away from one vendor solutions and you can start looking at best of breed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the next slide shows what people typically think of when they think of conferences or big gatherings where people are milling about from one station or booth to the next. And I believe this is a picture from the San Diego Comic-Con. But really what happens at a Connectathon is shown on the next slide with folks sitting at their systems and really doing some roll-up-your-sleeves kind of work where systems are connected and they're put on a network within this test event. But unlike typical conferences, these events are very, very focused. Each vendor is there with a goal in mind, and that goal is to increase interoperability with systems within their domain. And those systems have to comply to very rigid specifications that are done in an open manner amongst the members, and those are called technical framework documents. So there are usually 2 to 3 different volumes where the first volume would define the typical scenario that's being addressed. The second volume gets into the actual transactions that are exchanged between the actors that Zach had mentioned earlier, so those PCD01s, whatever, they're actually specific messages that are defined in the HL7 standard. If you're familiar with HL7, for example, PCD01 is an ORU-R01, which is an unsolicited observation from the HL7 standard. And then those messages carry semantic content or information from this other IEEE 11073 standard that was mentioned. So when you come together at a Connectathon, participants sign up to demonstrate their systems and applications, but as particular actors. So like if you think of the device enterprise communication integration profile that Zach mentioned, you have a reporter reporting information and a consumer consuming that. And applicants will come in and say, I want to serve as a reporter or a consumer, and then the monitors will check that according to very specific test cases that are written. The next slide shows even a little more detail of folks grouped together and exchanging information. You can see infusion pumps on the table and some other equipment, and the laptops are typically the interfaces to those devices and maybe the configuration management tools. So it really is a way to execute a lot of tests in a short period of time with a high level of concentration, and to get at your other products that would be in a typical healthcare scenario. The next picture is sort of a panoramic view to give you a sense of the size. This is actually from the Chicago venue, and as I said, we've now moved to the Cleveland area, which has a nicer venue because there's actually windows, so we're not down in feel like you're in a dungeon for a week testing away. But this is a really the space provided is very ample, and you can sit and collaborate with your peers. If you have questions, there's a lot of discussions. The other thing that's great about this is when we do come across problems or issue areas, there's a lot of discussion, and that gets fed back into the specifications or the standards. So there's this constant iteration over the cyclical year that IHE has that allows much improvement in the standards and specifications. It's hard to see in this picture, but you'll see some folks with red vests on. Those are the monitors who go around and observe the test cases being executed. And they'll go and have someone start, like a reporter, start a test, and they'll actually see this consumer receive it. And also there's systems in place to capture the actual electronic transfer of the messages, and those messages get fed into tooling, which does validation, and I'll show that in a minute. So the monitors are typically a wide range of folks, some with clinical or operational experience. There are IT folks. NIST has provided since the start computer scientists to help with the work, and so they're very involved as both the domain and from the IT side. And remember that one of the things that we're really looking, or what is really being tested at a Connectathon, is not necessarily the device, so like the internal operation, but more the information between the devices. And as Zach mentioned earlier, a device is often coupled with an information system called a gateway, which works to either translate or map that information into a particular standard, in this case HL7, carrying that 11073 information. So in summary, on the next slide, we see several bullets which kind of highlight what I was just mentioning, that the event is typically about a week long, 4 to 5 days. It's on a large testing floor, and as Zach showed, you see that what's being tested really emulate real-world environments and situations, typically focused in a hospital setting. And I'll talk in a little bit more about the need for even more remote kinds of devices, perhaps telehealth or devices that can help folks from the home. So vendors typically set up their systems that just like they would in a hospital situation. They bring their equipment and they get connected and they're off and rolling. And again, there's some rigorous test tools that help with all the validation. And there are many different kinds of integration that is going on, from things like security to performance to network and error handling. For example, we might do a test where we disconnect the Ethernet and see if the device can actually get reestablished and start communicating again. So there's a slew of those. There's other very important base kinds of tests, like Zach mentioned, with the synchronous time, to make sure that the devices and the gateways are synced to a common clock, so that when there is a time denoted in the message, it's actually meaningful, versus you often hear of a device that may be out of sync a week, a year, or sometimes when it was first configured. And then recently here on the East Coast, when we do our turning back the clock in the fall, that can cause havoc with time synchronization. So next, I'd like to give you a little information on some of the tools that are actually used to help to do this. And we have some links here. There are several tools that NIST has provided. And before getting into those, I also want to mention a tool that IHE provides called Gazelle. It's a test management tool, and this is where folks come in to sign up for a Connectathon event. And then this is where they would proclaim, I want to be a particular actor within a particular integration profile. And then the system assigns them test cases that they must complete by the week's end to successfully claim or to claim success, and then to put out a what's called an integration statement, which Zach will get into in a moment. But it's so there's links here that show both a pre-Connectathon test, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and then the tool itself that's used for a Connectathon. And basically what these tools do is they allow you to put the transactions that are captured between the actors into the tool, and it parses the fields, and the fields are made up of various components and subcomponents, and there are many things that are checked, like data types, and is it repeatable, and so that's called the cardinality, and what are the appropriate value sets that are used. So it would know that if a particular term is used, if that's a legal term at that point in time. So there's a lot of really detailed checks that happen. And it's not, these tools aren't only available for the patient care device domain, but all the domains that are there at the Connectathon, as I mentioned earlier, some of the sample ones like cardiology, radiology, IT infrastructure. So stepping back a little bit, there's also another event that gets people ready for the Connectathon. And for some domains it's required, for others it's informal, but it's called a pre-Connectathon. So essentially what happens is you will put your application or your product up against a reference implementation or a test system, and that's what NIST provides. And so you connect, in some cases live, by providing like an IP address and a port, and then establishing a particular test to run, and you're actually, through live connection, exchanging information and getting on-the-fly validation of that information. The nice thing about the tools that NIST provides, they're all web-based. They're available every day of the year, and you can use them to actually help develop your product and see, sort of get instant feedback from the messaging perspective of what's going on. So the second bullet from the bottom, medical device terminology, there's a tool that, a database essentially of terminology that's been built by NIST, and this is in conjunction with more of an infrastructural profile that's called Rosetta Terminology Mapping. That effort is led by a GE employee, Dr. Paul Schluter, and he's a principal engineer there who's been working in the field for years. And what we're doing is taking the 11073 terminology information and harmonizing that across all the vendors. So typically what's done, as most of you are aware today, is there will be proprietary solutions in place. And what happens at the gateways or these integration products is they'll map the proprietary information into standard-based information so that everyone is using the same terminology. And so this Rosetta terminology project, which we'll talk about in a moment, gets at harmonizing across all participants so that everybody's in agreement of what a term is and what it means. And then there's a tool that provides that information, which I'll show shortly. So now I'd like to give you a little more specific about how do we actually get at building some of the tools and what do the tools provide. Shown here are ways that we get at rigorous testing. In the bottom right-hand corner are how we get our what we call validation requirements or testable assertions. And the testable assertions are all in software code, in particular formatted files, which is XML, but we derive those from handwritten specifications. And I mentioned earlier about the technical framework documents, but at the top level we have the HL7 standard message definitions. These are, as Zach said, PCD01s, or as I said later, ORU R01 and HL7. So this gives very specific information about what a message would look like. Below that are what are called value sets. These are terms or enumerations or values that can be put into the HL7 message as a carrier. And as I also alluded to, we have this ISO IEEE 11073 nomenclature standard, which gets very specific for devices. So there's very specific terms that are exchanged, and again, when a reporter sends some information that is used by a consumer actor, both are in agreement of what that means, so you don't lose semantic value, and that's really important, and that's where the rubber sort of hits the road here. So if you're doing things like clinical decision support, the terminology or the meaning of what's being exchanged stays in place, and everyone's on the same page. And below that, we actually have test cases, which have very specific values. You know, this might be like a blood pressure range or a certain drug or how many milliliters of that drug. So at the far right of that bottom corner, you see these files that we use with the dashed lines around it, and that gets fed into our validation services. So we take those testable assertions, we codify them in software, again, based off the standard, the domain framework, the terminology, and the test cases, and we feed that into our validation. So this red message in the middle can be fed into the validation tool, and you immediately get a report out of that that says, yeah, your message complies to the standards and specifications, or it doesn't. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is when you're talking about a standard, standards tend to be very open-ended. So some of the great work that the IHE PCD and other domains do is they take that standard and they constrain the information so that it's very testable. There are very clear requirements. They're not optional, they're required, they must be there, and they must be of a certain terminology or a certain value, etc. So this is how we can do very rigorous checking from a tooling perspective, and this gives immediate feedback to the participants. So it's as simple as this, putting the message into the validator and getting the report. So this gives you an idea of how we build our tools. And in the next slide, we see how we have different environments, as we call them. So in the top half, you see what's called instance test environment. This would typically be the environment we would be working in a Connectathon, where, again, you have a message, you feed it into the test system, which is made up of a test management and services, and then you get a report out of that. So it's very similar to the slide I just showed, where the message is fed in, it uses a bunch of services and validation artifacts, and things like vocabularies and certain value tables, and it gives you immediate feedback. In the bottom half of the diagram is what's called isolated system, and this is where I had mentioned the pre-Connectathon. This is a typical environment that the pre-Connectathon would be in. In the very right-hand corner at the bottom, there's what's called a system under test. This is your application or your product, and then it would interoperate through either some sort of a router or a proxy into the test system, which again here is shown as the test management and services. And there's interactions going back and forth from that system under test to the test system. So the test system can act as any kind of actor. So under that services box in the middle lower part, you see a bunch of things we call test agents. And these are analogous to what IHE calls actors. So you may remember Zach talking about a device observation consumer, or DOC, or a device observation reporter, DOR. We build test agents that simulate the operation from a messaging perspective, and that interoperates with the system under test, again at the very bottom right-hand corner. So these messages go in and out, and they can either initiate or be receiving, and they also acknowledge receipt of the messages as required in the specifications. And these are all defined in those technical framework documents. And then what happens is very specific test suites are written which these test services emulate. And so we can, again, either act as an actor, or we can just do static validation like the top part, the instance test. There's actually a third environment, which really is what the Connectathon is. It's a peer-to-peer environment where you have many vendors, many applications working together. And then the test, ideally what would happen is the test system would sit in the middle of that. But it's a much, much more complicated problem, and we don't yet have solutions for that. We have pieces of it. So what we do in the Connectathon is the instance test environment, again, the top part of the diagram, where we pick off a message or have the participants show us a log of their file, and they paste that message into a test management tool, again called Gazelle, and then we actually take those messages and validate them through the tool. So not only is there sort of inspection testing being done by a monitor, there's this very rigorous message validation testing being done by these tools. So operationally, what does that look like? Again, this is sort of a repeat, but I want to stress at the bottom part you see these specification constraints. Again, you have the standard, you have domain specifications, you may have vocabularies or nomenclature, and then very specific test cases and test values. So those get turned into these, as I said, assertions, and are used by the NIST test tool, which is directly above that. So the way that tests are operated, you either have your application or test system, which is called system application or product, which is called the system under test on the right in the middle, and you can either manually paste or put information into the test tool and get results, or you can, through the pre-Connectathon or the isolated environment, which I just showed, exchange messages where messages are sent from the system under test, or the test system provides stimulus to the system under test. And again, these are all done with by setting up an IP and a port, and they're done over a communication protocol known as MLLP. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the two types of environments you can work under, and essentially they validate the same information, but one is more interactive and one is just kind of a static slice in time of a message that was sent and is now captured. So next I'd like to just briefly talk about this idea of Rosetta terminology, which I mentioned earlier. We got the name from the decree, which had three scripts in the ancient Egyptian period, where there were three languages that all said about the same thing. So we called it Rosetta because what we're actually doing is we're harmonizing the terminology across all the vendor participants. And this again is under the great work of Paul Schluter from General Electric. So looking at the next slide, this gives you a sense of what's happening. So in the middle, you have basically terminology that is being mapped from typically proprietary or vendor-specific terminology. So you see like vendor A, vendor B, vendor C on the left. And so you have a set of vendor terms. And then what we do is we actually make sure that all the vendors agree to a harmonization of those terms. And so everyone, and these are all standardized to that ISO IEEE 11073. So you see a great reduction in the terms that are currently exchanged in some of the test cases and at the Connectathon. So from a little over 1,600 terms down to about 700 terms. So nearly a third, not quite, but nearly a third reduction. And that's of great benefit because everyone participating does this in an open consensus manner where the vendors all agree to share their terminology and to work with the standard terms so that we, again, know we're exchanging the same semantics. The other beautiful thing about this is not only is it just a term, but the information exchanged within a message has a particular term that can have what are called co-constraints or relationships. So for example, you might have heart rate, and there'll be a particular term for that. And associated with heart rate, you would have very specific units of measurement, so the chemistry and physics around what that is. And you may also have things like what body site does it apply to, and there may be only a small set that applies to. You might have things like enumerations or possible values that could be. So from the one term, from a conformance perspective, we can check many different things, and that really is getting at the semantic exchange or semantic interoperability of information versus just the syntactic. Is the field correct? Is it have the right data types, that kind of thing. So we're really looking at the meaning, and so it's really valuable work. The other benefit of this work is that new terms can be proposed by vendors. If those terms aren't yet in the standard, they can propose it in this database system we have, and then that gets worked out through the balloting process of the ISO IEEE 11073 standard. So it's an IEEE standard. There's a formal ballot process, a formal development process, and that information is fed into it. So there's a lot of cross work here between the standards body and this domainal group. And then as important from the NIST perspective and the test tooling perspective is it does allow us to do very rigorous checking on that semantics. Out of those terminologies, you can send that information in a number of ways. You can do it in, currently we only do it in HL7 version 2, but you could do it in documents in version 3 or in the native 11073 messaging protocol, which is a little bit outside the scope of this. But the idea is you have common terminology that everyone's agreed on, all the device manufacturers. The next slide shows just a quick snapshot of the actual system. So it's not intended for you to read all this detail, but it essentially has a bunch of columns that have very specific information. And so you can see what's called the reference ID, which is sort of the second column from the left, things like alarm state, alarm source, and then there's what are called term codes that are used for efficiency to represent that. It tells where in the standard the term comes from, and it gives other information like the unit of measurement, as I mentioned, and et cetera, et cetera. In the bottom half, whenever you click on a particular row, you'll see the detail around that. And so, for example, you'll see here that it has dimension centiliter per meter. You can see that in the sort of the center box. But so each of these terms have been vetted and are worked on until they become international standards, part of the international standard. And that's why you see red versus black. Black is adopted, red is being worked on, and there's some other colors and functionality in the system itself. So the next slide shows a set of different kinds of users that are available. We did this because there are different needs by different communities, and we can everyone has access to the system, but NIST has worked out what's called a memorandum of understanding with the IEEE to display the IEEE terminology for free. It's normally a pay-for standard. And the bottom SDO, which stands for Standards Development Organization user, is the most powerful user, and then you'll have vendors or contributing organizations and reviewers, people who have expertise but don't have any products, and then the general user. So folks can come to the system, they can download these XML files, and they can continue to do some of the things I mentioned earlier, like develop the standard, propose new terms. And this, again, feeds into some of the validation. Okay, so that hopefully gives you a sense of what the Connectathon is and some of the tools that are used to accommodate very rigorous testing. And I'm going to turn it back, lastly, to Zach to talk a little bit about integration statements.
Excellent. Thank you, John. The IHE integration statements that John had mentioned are documents that are approved by IHE to give an at-a-glance view of all integration profiles and actors that a vendor product has successfully tested with. The integration statements are not derived from a formal IHE certification program and are self-declared. However, the rigorous testing discussed earlier by John in the presentation gives a high level of confidence that any product or device will meet the given profile's functionality requirements out of the box. To obtain an integration statement for a specific product, the best place to start is with that product's vendor, as that vendor can typically provide the most current integration statement for their product or products. Alternatively, the integration statements can be viewed online at the link that you see there. Keep in mind that that URL is case sensitive if you want to jot it down. The P and R do need to be capitalized to get to the product registry. From there, one can search for all integration statements available for a specific organization or product, or for all systems within a given IHE domain and/or profile. The integration statements will show the date that the statement was completed as well, with only the most recent integration statement for that product available for viewing. This eliminates the need to search through several statements to view the most recent. The integration statement for each product will also provide a link to the product vendor's website if more information is desired on specific products or organizations. As you see here, we have an example of one of the IHE integration statements for the Iatric Systems Accelero Connect product. If you'd like to view this integration statement offline, you can download it from the handout section of your GoToWebinar menu that should be available for download here if you look at it right now.
Okay, we are now at our next Q&A break. And just a reminder that if you do have questions, please type them in the questions pane on your GoToWebinar control panel. We do have a couple of questions here so far. The first one is, will you provide a list of the EHR vendors that participate in the Connectathon?
Yes, we can certainly provide a list of those. John, do you know if such a list is available on the product registry site of those EHR vendors that have participated with Connectathon?
Yeah, so there's, I believe there's actually a whole list of that on the IHE wiki pages that were mentioned earlier. So within the patient care device domain area, all that information is kept, and as I said earlier, is transparent. So it's readily available on the site, but we certainly could provide that afterwards if you want more of a direct file, and we can contact Paul Sherman to get that.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, does IHE PCD enable bidirectional communication between a device and EHR?
Yeah, so the answer there is yes. So what happens, as Zach said earlier, is the device is normally coupled in a software gateway, and the gateway will map that information into HL7, and then that goes out into the EHR. So information, so it typically from a device is sort of a fire hose approach where you're getting all this information out, but the protocols that are built within the IHE domain are two-dimensional, and they're actually acknowledged, so that you always know that when, say, some sort of status update happens, that device knows, or the gateway that it's connected to knows that it's been received by the EHR. So all of the protocols defined, or the message exchange defined in the IHE domains are bidirectional.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, are these IHE PCD standards just for an acute care hospital, or can these be used for home health?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because so normally folks look at two separate environments. Typically we call it a patient care device health connectivity and personal health device connectivity. So patient care is typically what we just talked about, the larger devices, your respirators, your ventilators, patient monitors, so very complicated devices that are often in hospitals or in acute care settings. The personal health device space are more of your telehealth, your home kind of devices, so you might have something as simple as a thermometer or a weight scale or maybe a pulse oximeter. And what happens is that there are various protocols used to communicate, say, a wireless, say a thermometer, say through Bluetooth or Zigbee, and that will go to a tabletop device, which is typically called an aggregator. And what that device does is it converts the information into HL7. And so what happens is you're actually exchanging from that tabletop aggregator out to some sort of health record, or maybe the doctor's office, or your personal file. It's using the same message structure, the same protocols, the same standard, the same terminology that's been developed within IHE PCD. And many of you may have heard what's called the Continua Health Alliance, and they're really focused on the personal health space. And so the great thing about some of the tooling and the work within IHE PCD is the personal health group has agreed to harmonize and use the same standards and protocols. So again, it's using the IHE transactions, which are HL7 messages, and exchanging information with semantic content to the ISO IEEE standards. So they do this through things like wide area networks versus maybe more Ethernet connected kinds of systems. But the same protocols are used, the same descriptions, and we're able to harmonize these efforts and really grow the community, which is invaluable because folks are now adopting standards, where in the past you'd have proprietary solutions, and companies like Iatric or Epic or Cerner would have to build all these integration interfaces to accommodate each of the systems they're dealing with. So the way to go for interoperability and even integration before interoperability and showing conformance is to do standard-based message exchange. So hopefully that answered that. Yes, indeed, there's a lot of work, and this does apply to personal health as well as patient care device or critical care kinds of environments. And that also works over ambulatory settings as well. So you might have like a ventilator that's in an ambulance, and you want to forward the settings into the hospital setting so that you don't have to spend time doing that. So there are definitely a lot of collaboration going on there.